Alright class, so today we're going to have review video number 2, and just letting you know ahead of time, we've got about 20 something minutes left on my camera, so it will be switching. I'm going to do half today and half tomorrow, possibly without any warning. So we're going to look at, for this first part in this video, imperialism and the progressive era. Now, first thing we have to know is that we did not always have imperialist policies. In fact, that all the way back to George Washington, we'd had that idea of keeping out of other countries' foreign affairs. Now, we didn't fully stay out of it when it comes to like interfering, because we know that, War of 1812 kind of came out of several years of that. But we did not colonize in the way that Europe had. So this has been our policy dating back to the beginning of the United States, all the way up until we end up getting involved in the Spanish-American War. Some of the things that led us to the Spanish-American War is this policy that's been going on for most European nations of setting up colonies for the sake of economic interests, and the fact that during this time period, all of the nations are building up their powers, which is also what's going to drag World War I into happening. And so really a reason for both imperialism and the future with World War I is jingoism. And jingoism is one of those words that we have said that we need to know, and that's like a ultra-nationalist policy, that belief that not only is your country great, but it's so great that others need to be just like you. And that ties in with the poem that we read, The White Man's Burden, and that idea that Europeans had felt that not only were they the greatest nation, but they were taking things over for the purpose of bettering them and making them more like Europe. So jingoism comes from that making things more like you extends into the idea of spheres of influence existing. And spheres of influence may be dealing with making others like you, but also when it comes to selling products, the economy, and gaining more supplies, more resources that can be traded to make your country even greater. The U.S. during this time period needs more products that they can actually sell, a greater market. So while I said that we had not as a nation been involved in any type of dealing with foreign affairs, colonization, the U.S. had in the past purchased some land, and one of those was Alaska, and that goes all the way back to the gold rush, where we started spreading out coast to coast, manifest destiny. 1867, a purchase was made from Russia, and this ends up being called Seward's Folly, because it is viewed as a mistake to have purchased Alaska, because there's nothing up there other than ice, another name for it, Seward's Icebox. And so this goes back to poor purchase by the United States. Later on it proves to not be, because we know Alaska does have oil, but initially once those silver mines were over-mined, there was nothing there. In 1898, so 20-something years later, Hawaii ends up being overthrown. We talked about that in class, the whole pineapple dole and banana wars that are going to go on throughout the world, funded by businesses and the U.S. government. But Hawaii is overthrown, so they have Alaska, Hawaii. Those are both made as purchases before the complete move towards Spanish-American War. And something that I had mentioned just the other day in class when we talked about how countries were trying to build their military was this whole idea of building empire that came from Alfred Mahan. And Alfred Mahan had written the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and discussed the need for a strong navy. But of course that also translates into the idea of a strong military. So kind of a lot of these things that are pulling the United States into the Spanish-American War are also going to pull all of the nations into World War I. Well, not all of Europe. So these are the things that pull us into the Spanish-American War. But in addition to these, there are some more main reasons that we get pulled into the Spanish-American War and become a imperialist nation for a while, and that has to do with the fact there is a revolution in Cuba because of the mistreatment of Cubans by Spanish for a long, long time, incredibly harsh rule. In the United States, because if there's a revolution going on or an uprising, a revolt going on, that close to mainland United States, that close 100 miles from Florida, the United States needs to start investigating it. So the United States sends down a ship to go and see what's going on, and that is the USS Maine. And the USS Maine, on a mission just to observe, is going to end up being sunk. What we've discovered in the many, many years since then is that it was because of some problems with the mechanics of the ship, and it just accidentally exploded, not to mention the way that the black powder had been stored on that ship. But immediately the newspapers, which are run by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, Hearst and Pulitzer have been competing to see who could sell the most newspapers, and this whole thing ends up coming down to something called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism, we know, came from that idea of the comic strip that had the yellow kid in it, and it was to be like really attention grabbing, sell newspapers, as many as they possibly could. They were both trying to build their newspaper empires, and so with the USS Maine sinking, exploding, they immediately publish it, saying the Spanish have attacked the United States, that they've hit a mine, that it exploded, and it's an act of war. And so the newspapers start pushing this idea of that the United States needs to get involved. American citizens are unhappy, and there's been this big rallying cry for the war, and that's remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, and the war begins. So the U.S. goes down and starts to fight in Cuba. But in addition to that, Spain has a lot more territories, and we know that the United States needs a greater amount of influence in the world, more places to sell our products, to grow our economy, and one of those places is China, that all of Europe is kind of getting involved in, the United States is as well, and there's a Spanish colony that's located close, and that is the Philippines. So George Dewey is going to lead the American initiative, the American campaign in the Philippines, and we end up taking it because, well, jingoism, and so we can be able to trade more of our goods in China, gain access to their resources. And that comes down to something called the open door policy. The open door policy was that idea that no one nation should be spreading their sphere of influence over China, but rather everyone should be involved in trading. So it keeps China from being colonized by Europeans because the United States proposes this, but as we see John Hay proposing this, we can really think that it's more that, yeah, the United States is starting to gain some footing in the world with the Spanish-American War, but at this point we're really not that powerful, and we know that if one European nation goes in there, the United States will not be able to trade. So lots of these imperialist, like foreign policies coming in place, and we said they're propelled by jingoism, and many Americans feel this way. One person who's going to push for this is Josiah Strong, who is an evangelist in the United States. He's able to reach many, and he preaches the idea that, the United States needs to be able to expand out, that it is the best thing for many people throughout the world, and it goes along with the poem that we read, once again showing the feelings of many Americans. But against this, we also have the Anti-Imperialist League, which has many of the wealthy, influential, important Americans in it. And in the Anti-Imperialist League, Andrew Carnegie, who we talked about with the robber barons, is going to be in support of most of this. So there's fighting going on throughout the world. We talked about Philippines, talked about George Dewey. Now we know in Cuba, the man who ends up taking control of this mission is Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt. So our future president, Theodore Roosevelt, is going to lead a number of people down into Cuba to fight. San Juan Hill, Kettle Hill, these are their main objectives. It's viewed as being Roosevelt's crowded hour. And we'll talk more about Roosevelt because we are in the progressive era as well. Secretary of State John Hay, who proposed the open door policy, ends up referring to this war as a splendid little war because Cuba is freed, it is quick, and relatively easy for the United States. And the Spanish-American War is going to end with the Treaty of Paris in 1898. The reason that's important is because we know there's so very many treaties of Paris. In addition to this, the United States is going to take Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico will become a territory. We're going to buy the Philippines. Cuba will briefly come under the control of the United States, but Cuba will end up being given back to the Cubans. The Philippines will be taken control of. Later on, they'll become an independent nation. But the first governor, because I said in the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, future president. Next future president, William Howard Taft, is going to be the governor of the Philippines. So the two things that end up getting Cuba their independence are the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment. So we'll say Teller Amendment, write that right next to it, and the Platt Amendment, and I'll just write amendment next to them both, are going to be what gain independence for Cubans, that is the Teller, and then the Platt ends up giving the United States some rights in Cuba, such as creating a naval base and kind of growing that sphere of influence that we do have in some way. So we've looked at these, and they're kind of, well, you can look at them and see the First World War is going to come out of many similar reasons, and many of these things will lead to it. So the United States has grown their place on that world stage. And one way that the United States has grown, other than the open door policy and trying to put ourselves into China in some way, is also, under Teddy Roosevelt, the Russo-Japanese War. Now, as I say, under Teddy Roosevelt, that doesn't mean that the United States is fighting in this war. What it does mean is Russia and Japan are at war with one another, and Teddy Roosevelt's going to step in and arbitrate this. Arbitrator, one of those key terms that we had to know on the last test, to come to a fair conclusion to this war for both sides. And the United States is able to do this under Roosevelt, and it kind of sets a precedent for what's going to happen in the future, where the U.S. is going to many, many other times step in and act as an arbitrator. So the U.S. will do this both domestically and foreign with our president. Russo-Japanese War is also important because it is going to be one of the factors that leads towards Russian Revolution, Russian independence, because during the early 1900s, Russia becomes very strained both through the Russo-Japanese War and World War I, and will end up becoming a communist nation, and then leading to all of the stuff that happens during the Cold War, but we'll get there over the next month or two. The United States also builds the Panama Canal. This kind of came up because under the Spanish-American War, getting the Philippines was an ordeal, so they kind of had to cut that place through. Colombia didn't want to do this initially, but big stick policy issues with Teddy Roosevelt. The Panamanian Revolution is going on, so we're going to back one side. 10 years of construction, and we've gained further power as well as access to the Panama Canal for 100 years. Saying that our imperialist powers, foreign diplomacy under Roosevelt, this big stick policy is very similar to the Monroe Doctrine, or at least it's growing onto it. So saying the Monroe Doctrine, which I know goes all the way back to American History 1, what was the Monroe Doctrine? Well, the Monroe Doctrine was the idea that European powers need to stay out of our hemisphere, make sure that their spheres of influence are not growing into our area. But to grow onto that is our Roosevelt Corollary, which can be viewed as the big stick policy. And that Roosevelt Corollary is the continued growth of the big stick policy. The U.S. will be the only nation that is able to intervene in anywhere in Latin America. This is where we start to really grow our power even further in our hemisphere, where later on we'll be the big brothers to Latin America, this big brother type policy, and it's going to grow into many other ways. So that's Roosevelt's policy, which is going to continue to influence the next two presidents, and this is one of the ways that Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson are all similar, is when it comes down to foreign policy and domestic policy. They're all the progressive presidents, but slightly different. Taft is going to have dollar diplomacy, where money is going to be given rather than a threat of force. We're going to use financial policies to try to influence what's going on, to get ourselves into various areas of the world. And Wilson will have missionary policy and missionary or moral policy or moral diplomacy. So we'll put like a little cross there and put missionary or moral diplomacy. It is all based on where the U.S. is going to refuse to negotiate with any illegal governments, illegal by the United States standards, and will not support any type of revolution intervention that happens unless it's what we agree with. Hence what happens under Woodrow Wilson in Mexico, and why Pancho Villa will be fighting against the United States. One of those issues that we get wrapped up in during the time period of World War I. So we start to grow. There's going to be anti-U.S. feelings throughout the world. Philippines are definitely one place, as is Mexico, because we've just kind of grown ourselves a little too much. Now, we'll probably come back to the early 1900s here in a little bit. I know we're talking about World War I now. But we'll talk about some of the cultural issues probably next week. Before we do that, we did talk about a couple of these progressive era issues that happened, and one of them was the issue of equality or segregation, desegregation. And the two people we looked at as an example of differing viewpoints on the same issue were W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And if we're going to put some of their policies down here around them, I'll change colors so that maybe we can differentiate. We had Booker T. Washington, who had the Atlanta Compromise. And the Atlanta Compromise came down to the idea that in order to achieve equality, it had to be done economically through work. And the only way to get good work was through education. So he created the Tuskegee Institute. And the Tuskegee Institute was technological agricultural college for black Americans in order to try to gain equality through work, which was the Atlanta Compromise. W.E.B. Du Bois, initially a follower of Booker T. Washington, disagreed, and he created the Niagara Declaration of Rights, which spelled out the need for an immediate total equality right off, because if you don't have total equality, it's not going to happen at all. He also founded the NAACP in order to try to make those rights happen. And it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that demand for equal rights now shows the difference between how people were going to fight those Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were a continuation of the black codes from pre-Civil War era, where all sorts of very laws were put in place for the purpose of oppression and segregation. And part of the reason this was possible was because of the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, where Homer Plessy had ridden in a white train car, was arrested for doing so, went to the Supreme Court because that obviously is against the 14th Amendment, but the Supreme Court decided that separate but equal was the doctrine that would be followed in the United States. So we have that going on in the United States at this time. The next section as we talk about many of these progressive era issues. So we have the issue of segregation, the issue of women's rights, and World War I is going to be mostly what puts a halt to these real reforms happening. Many of the reforms, we have suffrage, populist, temperance. The temperance movement is going to feed right into the women's suffrage movement. But a lot of the problems that are happening or being addressed during this reform era is because of the massive wealth gap, which is the distance between rich and poor, and all the things we talked about during the Gilded Era. So there's a lot of need for reform. And so there's a move towards some socialist ideals between Henry George, his progress in property, and the idea of a single tax, a progressive income tax. Edward Bellamy writes a socialist tale, and so this ends up pushing towards, Eugene Debs, who we talked about with the Pullman strike, how he's been arrested. He's going to end up running for president several times. 1912 is when he's really going to do well, and that's a pretty major election for the United States. He's going to be in charge of the American Socialist Party, and he had been the leader of the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as Wobblies. We talked a little bit about this when we looked at the Gilded Age and that labor and unrest. Wobbling is the practice of destroying business equipments in your industry in order to try to protest, because you can't do as much work if things are being wobbled, or also possibly that they were looked at as being drunk workers and used as an insult. Either way, Eugene Debs can be in charge of the IWW, American Socialist Party, and he's going to run in 1912 against Woodrow Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt, as they all run for election that year. We'll talk more about that in just a second. A lot of progressives emerge. This is the era of the social gospel. We've already talked about that. A lot of government reforms are going to happen. We said there's a focus on trying to improve things. And some of these are direct primaries. And direct primaries meaning that we as Americans are going to actually choose those people who are going to run for president within the parties rather than the parties themselves choosing them. That's going to come after Woodrow Wilson's election, but they're going to be moving towards it during the progressive era. Initiatives, and we talked about initiatives and reforms, referendums, which are very similar. A referendum and initiative, both are people being able to decide on how a law will, or whether a law will or will not pass, will or will not be used. But an initiative is proposed by the people through petition, and a referendum is something where our representatives decide that it's such a big issue that we as voters should be choosing it. A recall is an election to remove one of those politicians who's not representing the people, not representing the interests of us, and also the direct election of senators. And the direct election of senators is going to be the 17th Amendment, because prior to this, all of the senators were chosen by the House of Representatives, because every 2 years we elect them. They're supposed to represent us, but during the progressive era, people like Robert La Follette are going to see this as being an overreach of the government. Robert La Follette had been a governor, a senator, and overall just someone who fought for progressive ideals. He's kind of one of the leaders of the progressive era. He also believed in women's suffrage, which we read a passage from him when we looked at women's suffrage at primary sources. and how they've been treated unfairly. But all of this leads to our first progressive era president was McKinley, but our first real progressive president was Teddy Roosevelt. And we talked about just a moment ago and in class the big stick policy. Some of the things that he does during his presidency is that he is known as the trust buster because he breaks up many trusts, starts to control a bit more as the government, and will view his presidency as the bully pulpit. Wants to make a square deal for all Americans, and that includes 3 C's, and that trust busting comes down to one of those, and that is conservation, control of corporations, and consumer protections. And consumer protections is the first one we'll talk about real quick, even though we mentioned the fact that the trust buster is where he starts to control corporations and also kind of a consumer protection there. But consumer protections, when we looked at the idea of the jungle and the jungle exposing all of the issues with the meat packing industry, it's going to... Okay, so the last video cut off. I can't remember exactly where we are, so I'm going to assume the election of 1912. If not, and we're just before that, we're looking at the difference between Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Just go through your notes, make sure at the review session that you ask me, and I will try to make sure that I improve on what you need to know. So let's just look at the 1912 election and hope that was it, and then move into Wilson's presidency. So we know that Taft and Roosevelt both fought for the election, and Roosevelt had been president twice. Taft had been the chosen successor for the Republican Party, and in 1912, Taft is chosen to run for re-election. But Roosevelt formed his own progressive party called the Bull Moose Party. Bull Moose Party was also known as the Progressive Party, and they're going to have the platform of New Nationalism. And New Nationalism is that continuation of these progressive ideals to expand more, to protect the public, basically build more under the square deal or 3 C's that Roosevelt had. Supports many progressive reforms. Taft is going to be the conservative Republican candidate, and Wilson will be the progressive Democrat. So as Wilson is the new progressive Democratic leader, he runs on a platform of New Freedom. And New Freedom is going to be that thing that defines Wilson's presidency, aside from when it comes to civil rights, which he kind of lied about as he moved in. But that is the ending of the wealth being concentrated at the very top, antitrust laws, banking reform like a national bank, lowering tariffs, opening up our trade to the world, and basically continuing much more of the policies that Roosevelt had in place. So in the election of 1912, you wind up between Wilson, the Democrat, Taft, the Republican, Roosevelt, the Bull Moose, and Eugene Debs, the Socialist. Debs, not really a player in this, not really a factor. He gets about 1 million votes, which is a lot for a socialist or even a third party during this time period. Wilson is the Democrat. Taft and Roosevelt are going to get over 50% of the vote together, but that kind of cuts both of them out. Wilson wins with only a 42% popular vote, which means that he does not have the mandate. He does not quite have the support of the people in the United States. But he does win, and he's going to use his new freedom to fight the evils of society. Tariffs, trusts, banking, fight against poverty, because he'd been very influenced by Jacob Riis and his How the Other Half Lives. He lowers tariffs for the first time since the Civil War, and the lowest since they've been there, and that's called the Underwood Tariff. He puts together a provision for a permanent income tax allowed by the 16th Amendment, which is going to be the main source of revenue for the government. We have a system of national banks, a Federal Reserve that's put in place in order to have banking reform. He starts to regulate businesses with the FTC. This is how he differs from Roosevelt, where Roosevelt broke apart trust based on what he thought was good and bad. The FTC is going to be the thing in place to actually investigate corporate practices and regulate them, and they do that through the Clayton Antitrust Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act is a lot like the Sherman Antitrust Act, only it actually has teeth. It is a stronger law, it protects unions, and it makes sure that businesses will be disassembled if they are unfair. Suffrage movement is during this time period through Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the leader of the modern suffrage movement. Women gained support through World War I, which we already know. But laissez-faire policies end under Wilson. More social reforms happen. Women gain the right to vote with the 19th Amendment after World War I. African Americans, as we know from Wilson's presidency, are continually ignored. Oppression even gets worse, and World War I seems to end all of these reforms. And that's what the next video is. So, thank you, and here's the next video. I can do that very quickly due to the fact that you have spent some time working on it as a project and probably know a good amount of it. So first thing, the causes of the war. One, there's instability. Why is there so much instability in Europe? Well, the reason there's so much instability is because you have all these old empires that are in the midst of an arms race. Germany being one of the most recent countries to become part of the European Union after the fall of the Prussian Empire, is really trying to make a name for themselves. So all these countries are building up their militaries, building up their navies, going back to the Alfred Mahan, Influence of Sea Power Upon History book, and continuing to grow. There is an alliance system, and it is between these old-style empires. All these nations that are trying to grow, and all of them are monarchies, all of them even being related to each other in one way or another. And so you end up with the major powers coming together. And we'll say our alliances that are created are the Triple Alliance, which is also known as the Central Powers. And the Central Powers in World War I were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, sorry, taking a while to write that, and the Ottoman Empire. And then the other side, the Triple Entente, also known as the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia. Don't have Italy listed because Italy is not a major power yet, and they kind of switch sides between over the course of this war. So we know that these alliances are what are going to propel us into the war, and we just switch colors for you because we're going to write here the #1 catalyst for coming war, and that was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And he was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. Gavrilo Princip, when he assassinated Franz Ferdinand, is going to end up making Austria-Hungary go to war in Serbia. Ottoman Empire will support them. Germany goes in, and Germany decides that they need to attack France before Russia, or attack Russia before France can get involved. France actually ends up attacking Germany, and then everyone is involved in this war. The group that attacks and kills Franz Ferdinand, with Gavrilo Princip being the one who actually does the assassination, is the Black Hand. And we talked about this in class and some of that scenario, so hopefully you remember it. But this war quickly escalates and will devolve into trench warfare. As Germany attacks Russia, winds up in a two-front war because France is able to mobilize quickly. They are able to hold off pretty quickly, or hold off and even win many of the battles early on because of their Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a major full Western Front attack on France, and it had actually been developed for decades before the war started. But Britain gets involved, ends up being a two-front war as well, and they get bogged down into trench warfare. The United States does not get involved in the war immediately. It's actually going to take a while, and President Woodrow Wilson declares neutrality to begin with. The U.S. goes back to a policy of isolationism. But we're not 100% isolationist because Woodrow Wilson, of course, wanted to lower tariffs. We know that he had lowered tariffs, the lowest that they had been since the Civil War, with the Underwood tariff. And he's going to develop sympathy for the Allied cause, trades with France, trades with Britain, and that's going to lead to, through submarine warfare with U-boats or undersea boats, with Germany, the sinking of the HMS Lusitania. And the HMS Lusitania was a British passenger ship, a cruise liner, that had been going across the Atlantic, got loaded down with U.S. munitions being given to the Allies with Triple Entente, and then it sunk. But this will end up, as President Wilson sticks to his guns and keeps us out of war, because that is his slogan. He kept us out of war in 1916 to get reelected, will keep us out. But the Lusitania, in order to keep us out of the war, some negotiations are done between Germany and the Allies, and the Sussex Pledge will be signed. And the Sussex Pledge is the agreement that Germany is not going to use unrestricted submarine warfare, that in the event of searching for war materials, that they will stop a ship that seems to be a passenger ship, board it, search, and capture the people if necessary, if they are doing something, rather than just immediately sinking them. So, U.S. stays out of the war. The U.S. will not be able to stay out of the war forever, because Germany will end up sending the Zimmerman telegram, or Zimmerman note to Mexico, trying to get Mexico involved in attacking the United States in order to gain the land that had been lost during the Mexican-American War back. The reason for this was because the war quickly reached a stalemate. It was trench warfare. People could not make it through no man's land. All sorts of technology had to be developed. Submarines, airplanes being used, Zeppelins, major, large-scale cannons, poison gases, which will end up being a war crime later on, and tanks to get across no man's land. This war quickly ends up being a very deadly, destructive, modern war. And things change significantly from the very beginning of the war, where people are still riding horses and using swords and dressing as though they're Napoleon's army, all the way up to thinking more what someone would look like in the modern era. So this war is one of those major transition points. So as the U.S. does enter the war, Wilson does have his idea that we need to have peace without victory, because peace without victory means that there are no losers. And without no losers, you can't have someone feeling oppressed and bad and having to rise up and basically avoiding the future war. This is a very idealistic peace plan, one that most of the European leaders will not really see as plausible, nor will Congress, as we'll talk about here in just a moment. So Wilson ends up having to bring this to Congress, try to declare war, because the president cannot declare war. And his reason is that we need to have a war to make the world safe for democracy. In addition to making the world safe for democracy, the U.S. kind of needs to get involved, because shortly before the U.S. enters, Russia is going to exit the war due to the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolshevik Revolution is the communist revolution, where Vladimir Lenin and his men will take over in the 1917 revolution, turning Russia to the Soviet Union. And we covered a little bit of that in class. Not much more that I'll say right now, due to the fact that I'm trying to limit the length of this video. When the U.S. entered the war, Selective Service Act is put in place. Selective Service Act, you still need to actually sign up for. More than 3 million people were entered into World War I. They received training for 9 months, and then in order to be brought to Europe, they were brought via convoy because we had lots of men, material, and war materials to get to Europe, which is known as being over there. Over there was a popular song of the era, not to mention the fact that men were leaving their homes. Most of them had not left their normal area that they were born and lived and worked, but now they were being sent to Europe, which is a very different spot than they'd ever lived before, or been before, plus the constant threat of chemical attacks or being hit by some type of large-scale battery, which can lead to PTSD, which at this time was called shell shock. So, men in the United States are fighting. We do have a couple of war heroes that we can mention here as great examples of what could happen in this war. General John Pershing, who also fought Pancho Villa in some of Woodrow Wilson's first foreign affairs that he had to deal with. He's going to lead the American Expeditionary Force, which are the soldiers being sent overseas, also known as doughboys due to the color of their uniforms, and led through the Argonne Forest Campaign, or the Western Front of the war. Alvin York will be a war hero. Initially, he wanted to be a conscientious objector, or someone who, due to their religion, would not be able to fight due to the fact they were pacifists, but after capturing, I believe, 125 Germans on the battlefield, and being a great leader, he will end up becoming a war hero as he comes back home. The end of the war, or the actual fighting going on, the official ceasefire is called armistice. And the armistice is on November 11th. And November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. So 11 a.m. So remember that today, we still honor this day of armistice through our Veterans Day. At one point it was veterans just for those of World War I, but then it becomes that for everyone. Talked about shell shock, some of the other problems that people could have other than the attacks. And of course there were all sorts of technologies that were created to help, like gas masks, but you could also wind up with trench foot because of the terrible conditions of the war. The United States, in order to get people bolstered into joining the effort, ended up creating the War Industries Board. And the War Industries Board was one where women and minorities were given jobs that had been previously held by those who were fighting in the war, and had them create things that were necessary to fight the war. Shells, munitions, tires, anything that was important. And the way that we were able to do that was through rationing. Rationing, where you had to use a ticket in order to get the things you needed. And so if you wanted to buy eggs, you would have to have a ticket for eggs in addition to your money to buy these. So all these opportunities are created because of this. Dangerous jobs. In addition to this, other conservation efforts like the Liberty Garden were created in order to send foods across to Europe for our soldiers. So this ends up becoming a total war where everyone is involved. We also have daylight savings time, which I know everyone loves, in order to reduce energy spending. It's because agricultural workers would be able to not light their homes as much, and you'd have an extra hour of daylight in the day. Liberty bonds, or kind of loans to the government in a way to raise money. The Committee on Public Information is created, and George Creel will be in charge of that, where he puts together the 4 Minutemen. And the 4 Minutemen were used to spread public information about the war in public events, so that people could gain the knowledge that was necessary, as well as to kind of boost morale. The I Want You campaign came out of this, as well as much propaganda which focused on trying to villainize or demonize many of those overseas Germans But of course that brings along with the anti-immigrant sentiment. Anti-immigrant sentiment will lead to things like the 18th Amendment, as many of the brewers in America were German. As we're trying to make sure that people are not speaking out against the war, Espionage and Sedition Act will be put in place, makes it illegal to speak out against the government. Schenck versus the United States is the Supreme Court case that is associated with this, because Schenck is destroying draft cards, and it goes to the U.S. He says that this, or so it goes to the Supreme Court because he says that this is a matter of free speech. He was merely expressing himself, but it is determined that this is an act of clear and present danger, and that it is likened to yelling fire in a crowded theater. So this is something that we're not able to do. There are limits to our free speech. In the war, I already said there were opportunities on the home front for women and minorities. African Americans did fight in the war in segregated units, because desegregation won't happen until Korea. But the Great Migration will bring many of the African Americans that had been in the South since Civil War Reconstruction and have stayed there as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, now have jobs they can move to in Chicago or New York. And this is going to allow for debate about civil rights, and we know that through Woodrow Wilson, steps backward happened. But it will allow for all sorts of other movements that we'll look at here in the next unit, like the Harlem Renaissance. Women take the jobs that are left by men, and it does allow for some advancement on their part as the 19th Amendment is passed. And the 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. The ones we need to know in this class for this test: 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th. 16th Amendment, income tax. 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. 18th Amendment, 18th Amendment, prohibition. And 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. As men were all close to each other in the war, the Spanish flu was spread as people came back. The Spanish flu infected millions and millions of people worldwide. As many as 40 million died. In the U.S., 1/4 of people fell victim to the Spanish flu, and about 500,000 died. It was the largest spread of the flu. Wilson and his plan for peace without victory is going to be expressed in his 14-point plan. And the 14 points are going to be revolving around greater amounts of democracy, freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, lowering tariffs, like the Underwood tariffs, so that more trade is going on, and then just self-determination to keep out of war and fix things. One of the ways that we could make sure that no one does this is through his idea of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations he's going to propose at the Versailles Peace Conference. And the Versailles Peace Conference is where the Big Four are going to debate how to end this war. The Big Four being the United States, Britain, France, and Italy. Italy was not involved to begin with, but they end up joining on the side of the Triple Entente later on. Central powers were left out. Germany, the one who's going to get the blame for this, and given all the punishment, will not be involved in the Versailles Peace Conference, and Russia was totally left out. Some of these negative feelings are going to end up leading into the Cold War later on. As we can see over and over, lots of stuff is impacting us throughout the future. Most of these 14 points of Wilson are going to be ignored, but the League of Nations will be secured. Britain, France, and Italy will all join the League of Nations. As the League of Nations idea is brought back to the United States, then Congress will not allow for this. Henry Cabot Lodge is going to fight the idea of the League of Nations. It weakens the U.S. government and will drag us into foreign affairs that we don't want to be a part of. Wilson is going to try to appeal to the people and get this voted on, and he will end up suffering a stroke, unable to bring it to the American people. And that is all of our World War I stuff. We will look at stuff later. Thank you.